Welcome back to Stamps US, where we uncover the history, secrets, and surprising values hidden inside old American stamps. Today, we are looking at a small green 1-cent stamp featuring one of the most famous faces in American history, George Washington. At first glance, this stamp may look ordinary, and millions of collectors have seen similar examples before. But before you throw it away or assume it is worthless, take a closer look, because the exact identification, condition, and especially the variety can make a huge difference in the stamp market. The stamp shown here is the 1938 1-cent George Washington Presidential Series stamp, commonly identified as Scott No. 804. It was issued on April 25, 1938, as part of the famous Presidential Series, a group of stamps that collectors often call the Prexies. This particular issue features Washington in a classic engraved portrait, printed in green, with the 1-cent denomination clearly shown on the left side. The design is simple, powerful, and instantly recognizable, but the real story behind this stamp is much more interesting than many people realize. The 1938 Presidential Series was created to honor deceased American presidents, and George Washington naturally received the 1-cent denomination. The stamp was produced by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing using engraved printing methods, giving the portrait those incredibly fine lines and detailed textures that you can see across Washington's face and clothing. More than 20 billion examples of this particular issue were produced, which is one of the most important facts for collectors to understand. And this is where the truth about value becomes very important. Many online listings show common old stamps with unbelievable price tags, sometimes claiming that an ordinary 1-cent Washington stamp is worth thousands or even millions of dollars. But collectors know that an asking price is not the same as a real market value. For the common Scott No. 804 single, current dealer references show values generally in the cents to low dollar range depending on condition and gum, while a typical used example is especially common. So, if you have this exact stamp sitting in an old album, do not immediately believe a huge internet price. But, and this is the exciting part, do not ignore it either. The reason is that collectors sometimes search for specific varieties and rare plate number combinations connected to this issue. In fact, some rare plate number blocks of Scott No. 804 have brought hundreds of dollars at auction, with one rare plate number example recorded at a $500 sale, and other rare numbers carrying significantly higher catalog valuations. This means that the stamp in your collection may look almost identical to another one, while the real difference could be hidden in a tiny detail. Collectors carefully examine the perforations, gum, centering, printing characteristics, and whether the stamp is part of a plate block or other special format. That is why identifying an old stamp from only its color and portrait is not always enough. Now let's talk about condition, because condition is one of the biggest factors in the stamp market. A stamp with heavy cancellation, tears, creases, missing perforations, stains, or damaged paper usually has very limited collector value. On the other hand, a clean example with strong color, sharp perforations, and original gum can be more desirable. The condition of the stamp shown in a photograph can only give us a general idea. Professional collectors usually inspect the stamp under magnification and compare it with catalog information before making a serious valuation. Another important clue is whether your stamp is a single or part of a larger piece. A normal single stamp may be common, but a block with a plate number can be a completely different collecting category. For this issue, some rare plate numbers are specifically sought after by specialists. Auction records show that rare plate number blocks connected to the 1938 Washington issue can sell for hundreds of dollars, proving that the hidden value is not necessarily in the portrait itself, it can be in a tiny printing detail that most people never notice. So what is the value of the stamp shown here? Based on the image and the common appearance of the 1938 1-cent Washington issue, I would not call this a $1 million stamp. A normal example is generally a low-value collectible, and current dealer references show common examples priced around the cents to dollar range depending on condition. But if you discover that your stamp is part of a rare plate number block or another special variety, the value can change dramatically. And this is exactly why I always tell collectors to look twice before throwing away old stamps. The biggest mistake is seeing a familiar face and assuming every example is the same. George Washington appears on thousands of American stamps, but different issues, perforations, plate numbers, and varieties can tell completely different stories. So, if you have this green 1-cent Washington stamp, take a close look. Check the perforations. Look for plate numbers if it is part of a block. Examine the gum and the overall condition. And most importantly, compare the exact stamp with a reliable catalog or a specialist reference. Do not judge the value by random online asking prices. This little 1-cent stamp may not be a hidden million-dollar treasure by itself, but it is a fascinating piece of American postal history, and in the world of stamp collecting, tiny details can sometimes make a much bigger difference than you expect. Next up, we are looking at a beautiful green 2-cent George Washington stamp from 1932, and this is one of the most recognizable designs from the famous Washington bicentennial issue. At first glance, it may look like just another old Washington stamp, but this little piece of paper carries an incredible story from one of the most important commemorative stamp series in American postal history. This stamp is the 1932 2-cent George Washington bicentennial stamp, commonly identified by collectors as Scott 707. It was issued to celebrate the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth, and the design features Washington's famous Athenaeum portrait, based on the 1796 work associated with artist Gilbert Stuart. The stamp shows Washington facing to the right inside an impressive architectural frame, with the dates 1732 and 1932 displayed on both sides of his portrait. The design was created as part of a special 12-stamp series honoring Washington's life and legacy. Now, when many people see a stamp this old, they immediately ask the same question: could it be worth hundreds, thousands, or even millions of dollars? And this is where we need to separate real stamp collecting from exaggerated internet claims. The truth is that the ordinary 1932 Scott 707 is a very common stamp because more than 4.2 billion examples were issued. Current dealer listings show common examples at very low prices, with a single listed around the cents range and a paying single around a few dollars. But do not let the word common fool you into thinking this stamp is unimportant. The history behind it is absolutely fascinating. In 1932, the United States Postal Service created a complete Washington bicentennial series, and each stamp showed a different image of George Washington. The 2-cent denomination was especially important because it featured the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait that many Americans instantly recognized. The series went on sale beginning January 1, 1932, and it became one of the major commemorative issues of that era. Look closely at the stamp in front of you. The first thing that stands out is the detailed portrait of Washington. The engraved printing style creates thousands of fine lines across the face, hair, and clothing. Around the portrait, you can see the large oval frame and the architectural columns. At the very top, the words United States Postage are clearly printed, while the two large one-like designs at the bottom actually represent the 2-cent denomination in the distinctive style of the issue. The dates 1732 and 1932 remind us exactly why this stamp was created. Now let's talk about the value in today's market. If your stamp is a normal single example of Scott 707, it is generally a low-value collectible rather than a million-dollar rarity. A common example in ordinary condition may be worth only a small amount. However, the exact condition, gum, centering, and format can still affect the value. A stamp that is clean, well-centered, and in excellent condition is always more attractive to collectors than one with heavy damage, creases, or poor centering. And this is where many stamp collectors make a mistake. They see a huge price on an online listing and assume that every stamp with the same picture is worth that amount. But an asking price is not the same as a confirmed sale. In the stamp market, the exact Scott number and the exact condition are extremely important. Two stamps can look almost identical, yet one may be worth only a few cents while another special item, such as a rare plate block or an unusual variety, may attract much more attention. The stamp shown here appears to be a single example, and based on the image alone, I would not call it a rare million-dollar stamp. But that does not make it worthless as a collectible. In fact, this stamp is a beautiful example of American history. It represents the 200th anniversary of Washington's birth and connects collectors directly to a major moment in U.S. postal history. The most important thing to remember is that condition can make a difference. Collectors examine the perforations around the edges, the centering of the design, the color, the gum on the back, and any signs of creases or damage. Even a small fault can reduce collector interest. On the other hand, a clean, fresh, well-preserved example can be more desirable, especially when it is kept in a complete collection or connected to a special issue format. So, if you have this green 1932 Washington bicentennial stamp in an old album, do not throw it away. First, identify it correctly. Look for the 1732 and 1932 dates, the 2-cent denomination, and the famous Washington portrait. Then check the condition carefully. And remember, the real value of a stamp is not determined by its age alone. Rarity, condition, demand, and the exact variety all matter. So what is the honest value of this stamp? For a common Scott 707 single, the market value is generally low, often in the cents to few dollar range depending on the format and condition. But the historical importance is much greater than the price tag might suggest. This is a genuine 1932 Washington bicentennial issue and a fascinating piece of American philately. And this is exactly why stamp collecting is so exciting. A stamp that looks ordinary to one person can tell an incredible story to another. Every line, every date, and every design detail connects us to the past. So before you ignore an old stamp, take a closer look and learn exactly what you have. Next up we are looking at a fascinating green 1-cent stamp that carries a powerful message about freedom, and this is not just an ordinary postage design. The words printed on this stamp are, "Freedom of speech and religion, from want and fear," making it a remarkable piece of American history from the World War II era. This is the 1943 United States 1-cent for freedom stamp, Scott number 908. It was issued on February 12, 1943, and was designed to promote the idea of spreading the four freedoms throughout the world. The central image shows liberty holding the torch of freedom and enlightenment, while the message below highlights freedom of speech and religion, along with freedom from want and fear. The stamp replaced the 1-cent National Defense stamp of 1940. Now, when collectors see an old 1940 stamp like this, the first question is usually, could this be worth thousands of dollars? And I want to be completely honest with you. The ordinary single stamp shown here is generally not a $1 million rarity. Current dealer listings place common mint or used examples around the 25 to 30 cent range, while a plate block is listed around $1.25. But the low price does not make this stamp unimportant. In fact, the history behind this small green stamp is incredibly powerful. During World War II, the United States was using stamps not only for postage but also to communicate patriotic ideas. The Four Freedoms stamp was created to remind people of the freedoms that were considered essential to a free society. Look closely at the design. At the top, you can see the words U.S. postage, followed by the 1-cent denomination. In the center is liberty holding a torch, representing freedom and enlightenment. Around the design are oak leaves, a symbol often connected with strength and endurance. And at the bottom is the powerful message, freedom of speech and religion, from want and fear. Every part of this stamp was carefully designed to communicate an idea. The stamp was printed in green using a rotary process and was issued in sheets of 100. The design is vertically arranged and measures approximately 3/4 by 85/100 of an inch. It may be small, but it carries one of the most memorable patriotic messages found on a U.S. stamp from the World War II period. Now let's talk about the value. If you have a normal single example of Scott number 908, the realistic market value is usually modest. A current dealer listing shows mint and used examples starting around 25 cents, while a plate block can be more valuable. A first day cover can also have a different value, with one current listing showing $8.50. This is why the exact format of the stamp matters so much. And here is the important lesson for collectors: never judge a stamp only by its age. A stamp from 1943 may be more than 80 years old, but age alone does not automatically make it rare. The number produced, the condition, the format, and special varieties all play a role in determining value. So if you find this green 1-cent for freedom stamp in an old album, carefully check its condition. Look for tears, creases, stains, or missing perforations. Also check whether it is a single stamp or part of a plate block or another special format. A normal single may be worth only a small amount, but collectors should always identify the exact item before making a final judgment. Based on the image shown here, this appears to be a common single example of the 1943 Four Freedoms issue. So I would not claim a huge value like $10,000 or $1 million for this particular stamp. The honest value is generally in the cents to low dollar range, depending on condition and format. But historically, this stamp is absolutely fascinating. And this is exactly what makes stamp collecting so exciting. Sometimes the greatest value of a stamp is not found in a massive price tag. Sometimes it is found in the story, the message, and the history printed on a tiny piece of paper. Next up we are looking at a small green 1-cent stamp that carries a message far more powerful than its tiny size suggests. At first glance, this may look like an ordinary old US postage stamp, but once you understand the history behind the design, you realize that this is much more than just a piece of paper. This stamp represents freedom, patriotism, and one of the most important ideas promoted during the difficult years of World War II. The stamp we are looking at today is the 1943 United States 1 cent for freedom stamp, Scott number 908. It was issued on February 12, 1943, and more than 1.2 billion stamps were produced. The stamp was printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and features a powerful design showing liberty holding the torch of freedom and enlightenment. But the most important part of this stamp may actually be the words printed at the bottom. The message reads, "Freedom of speech and religion, from want and fear." These words were connected to the famous Four Freedoms idea that became especially important during World War II. The stamp was designed to communicate a message of freedom and hope at a time when the world was facing one of the greatest conflicts in history. Look closely at the center of the stamp. You can see Liberty holding a torch high in her hand. The torch represents freedom and enlightenment. Around the central design are decorative oak leaves, giving the stamp a strong and patriotic appearance. At the top, the words U.S. Postage are clearly visible, while the 1 cent denomination appears on both sides of the design. Every detail was carefully arranged to make the stamp more than just a postage issue. Now, here is the question that many collectors ask when they find a stamp like this in an old album. Could this tiny 1 cent stamp be worth thousands or even millions of dollars? The honest answer is that a normal single example of Scott number 908 is generally not a $1 million rarity. Current dealer listings show common examples around the 25 to 35 cent range, while a plate block is listed around $1 to $1.25. A first day cover can have a higher value, with one current dealer listing showing $8.50. But before you dismiss this stamp as worthless, there is something very important every collector should understand. Market value and historical importance are not always the same thing. This stamp may not sell for a fortune as a common single, but it tells a powerful story about America and the world in 1943. During World War II, stamps were used to communicate patriotic ideas and national messages, and this issue is a perfect example of how postal history can connect directly with major events in American history. The stamp shown here is especially interesting because the design was based on Paul Manship's Liberty image, and the Four Freedoms concept was central to the message of the issue. The stamp was intended to help promote the ideals of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom from want and fear. Now let's talk about condition, because this is where the value of any old stamp can change. When collectors examine a stamp like this, they look carefully at the perforations around the edges. Are they complete? Are any missing? They also inspect the paper for creases, tears, stains, or thinning. The color is important too. A clean, bright example is usually more attractive to collectors than a damaged or heavily faded stamp. The gum on the back can also matter, especially when the stamp isn't used. Collectors may carefully check whether the original gum is still present and whether the stamp has been hinged or damaged. A very high-grade example can be much more desirable than an ordinary stamp. In fact, a recent auction catalog listed an extremely fine to superb, never hinged example of Scott number 908 with a professional certificate and a suggested bid of $28, showing how exceptional condition can make a major difference compared with a common example. And this is an important lesson for anyone who collects old stamps. Never judge a stamp only by its age. A stamp from the 1940s may be more than 80 years old, but age alone does not automatically make it rare. The number issued, the condition, the exact format, and the demand from collectors all play a major role. For example, a normal single stamp may have a low value, while a plate block, a special first day cover, or an unusually high-grade example can attract more attention. That is why professional collectors identify the exact Scott number and examine the stamp carefully before giving a final opinion. So, what is the honest value of the stamp shown in this image? Based on its appearance as a normal single example of the 1943 Four Freedoms issue, I would not call it a $10,000 stamp or a $1 million treasure. The realistic market value is generally in the cents to low dollar range for common examples, depending on condition and format. But the historical story behind this stamp is truly remarkable. And this is exactly why I always tell collectors to look twice before throwing away an old stamp. Many people see a small green 1-cent stamp and think it has no importance. But this stamp carries a message about freedom that was printed during one of the most difficult periods in world history. The design, the words, and the date all come together to create a fascinating piece of American postal history. If you find this stamp in your collection, check it carefully. Look at the perforations. Examine the condition. Check whether it is a single, a plate block, or connected to a special cover. And most importantly, identify it correctly. Do not trust random online listings that claim every old stamp is worth thousands of dollars. A real collector looks at the exact issue and the exact condition. So, while the common 1943 4 Freedoms 1-cent stamp may not be a hidden million-dollar treasure, it is still a beautiful and historically important U.S. stamp. Sometimes the true value of a stamp is found not only in its price, but in the story it carries. And this little green stamp carries a message that still has meaning today. Last one, we are looking at a very unusual looking 1-cent stamp from the 19th century. At first glance, many people might think this is a normal old postage stamp, but there is an important secret hidden in the design. This is not a regular stamp used to prepay postage. It belongs to a special group of U.S. stamps created for one very specific purpose, and today, we are going to uncover exactly what it is and how much it may be worth in the collector market. The stamp shown here is the 1879 United States 1-cent postage due stamp, Scott number J1. Instead of paying for postage in advance, postage due stamps were used to indicate that additional postage was owed. The design is instantly recognizable because of its large central numeral 1 surrounded by an intricate oval pattern, with the words U.S. postage and 1 cent forming the classic design. The 1879 postage due series was created with large numerals that made the amount due easy to identify. Now look carefully at this stamp. The design is completely different from the Washington and Franklin stamps most collectors are familiar with. There is no portrait of a president. There is no famous American figure. Instead, the entire design is focused on the denomination. If you enjoyed discovering the history and real market value of this fascinating old U.S. stamp, make sure to subscribe to Stamps US and turn on notifications so you never miss another rare stamp discovery. We bring you the stories, secrets, and surprising values hidden in American stamps. Subscribe now, and remember, before you throw away an old stamp, always take a closer look. You never know what treasure might be hiding in your collection.